Hi folks, this is Alan Watt, filling in for John Stadtmiller, and you'll excuse me standing in. I won't stand for the full 2 hours, I'll sit as well. But I got a call about an hour ago asking me to come in. Those who have heard me before hear me on Cutting Through the Matrix, where I go into the histories of this poor old planet of ours that really doesn't belong to us and probably never did, unless you get there before the advent of wealth and money. And this is November the 12th, 2007. Those who can still speak the tongues of Europe, and those who are listening from Europe, look into Alan Watt's Sentient Sentinel, and you can get transcripts downloaded for free with the different languages of Europe. And I have to thank all the staff that helped me out in all this. There's a lot of people involved. Although I could do with a few more of myself here. Maybe that's what the Superman had the right idea. He could duplicate himself and have all these robots doing all his work for him. Kind of like the Federal Reserve. I often wonder if they're all just clones. But that's the world we live in. It's an ongoing show where reality has been propagated to the public, instilled in our minds, helped by our parents who didn't know any better either, and way down the line for thousands of years, because the world is run by a select few families, really, that interbreed like crazy, and have held the incredible wealth. In fact, they decided what wealth was a long, long time ago, and it's very interesting that all of their symbols go back to Egypt, and all of those same symbols are all around us in company logos today, especially the big boys, the ones who own all the banks. And I'm certain they've also been behind the creation of all the major religions. They certainly have dominated them and run them right up to the present. And they're the elite of all religious groups. They're the top of all religious groups. And the big mystery is, who are these people? It's interesting to watch the Queen of England, for instance, go through her inauguration many, many years ago, sitting on the raised dais, which is just a pyramid, step pyramid, holding the scepter and a little part that looks like a little crook, like the Pharaoh did in ancient times. You'll see the same thing chiseled out in the stelas in Egypt. So ceremonies that were carried out thousands of years ago, right down to the ermine round the neck, the ermine, the black and white dots that Nimrod wore, are still worn today, and no one tells us why. Very interesting. But our world has been run by small groups, a small group really of people, down through the ages that moved around even in ancient times. And we tend to forget that Egypt itself dominated the ancient world for almost 5,000 years. That's a long time. A long 5,000 years. And they used to create cities for bureaucrats to deal with all their State Department, you might call it, or Foreign Affairs Department in the Commonwealth countries, to deal with all the incoming and outgoing mail. And they found some of these cities and dug up tablets with all the data that modern bureaucracies deal with. And it's mainly to do with population, how many people are there, how many pay taxes, and all the buying and selling taxes as well. Costed into it all. It was a huge business thousands of years ago, and nothing much has changed. Nothing much has changed, except that after moving down through the centuries and pulling their money out of one empire as they create the next, and flattening the one behind it, they're up to the global system now. The world, you see, is the little scepter she holds in her hand. And I'll be back after the following messages with more on this topic. Hi, folks. I'm Alan Watt, standing in for John Stadtmiller from Cutting Through the Matrix. The Matrix, the world around you as you have been taught to perceive it, and all that makes it tick, and how it interacts together. And it truly is one huge web, a web of deceit, because the entire system and entire reality that's been put into us, it didn't happen by accident. We don't just roll down through the centuries stumbling along with politicians sorting out problems here and there on a daily basis. Far, far from it. The politicians are really the fronts for very powerful families, and always were. And that's what democracy is, in fact. And in the US too, even though it had a form of democracy within the republic, which meant it had sort of bars around it so that they couldn't knock those bars down and extend their powers. Well, that went down long ago, and they have extended their powers. I think it was President Wilson who first used the term openly about America being a democratic nation. The same man who fronted for other people, very powerful people behind him, and which he admitted to in his own writings eventually, who gave the League of Nations the start, the embryo of a new world order, a world system, a standardized system which had been the dream of the elite for a long, long time. I'm pretty certain for probably thousands of years. And they saw it coming into view, and the best way to get it going was to get world wars going and getting everyone involved in these world wars. Therefore, they spent about 100 years creating alliances, building up to the wars, and then getting the wars started. It wasn't too difficult because young men, who are pretty stupid, by the way, young men tend to be rather stupid. They run on hormones, and the tribal system is still strong within them, and they want to belong. They want to belong to the biggest gang that has some kind of authority over others, and that is approved by the government. And young men having no power in their own daily lives, because most of them come from the working class or unemployed, that's generally how it is throughout the ages, they join the military. I'm not talking about drafting people in from all occupations. These guys join the military, so really they're mercenaries, and they get off on the national emblems that every country's been given with their flags and their various medals and all this kind of stuff. And they're taught to go out and kill and plunder, and feel very proud of it, although the people back home generally get the real story 50 years after the war, and had nothing to do with what you were told at the time. Everything you were told is always propaganda, because, as Karl Marx said, all wars are economic in nature, and sure enough, the big pirates at the top plunder every country they go into. That was how they lived down through the centuries. And some of these pirate families are allowed a certain amount of chess moves within this board game of theirs, this board game which is a bunch of rules that apply to them only. That's what knighthood is all about. Knights were sworn, they took allegiance to serve a master at any cost and obey any order they were given. And so the modern knights that came up through the pirate era, the skull and bones, going from the Knights Templars right upwards, and that was a symbol, by the way, of Knights Templars flag. When they went to sea, it was a skull and bones. They became the pirates, and they looted a good part of the planet. So they were allowed to have competition between powerful families, even though these big families were often related, in fact. And they push each other out the way sometimes, and take over their other countries, but they always spare their cousins. And that's what kings and queens were about down through the ages. They had ongoing wars which are tremendously profitable, and it also serves the purpose of depopulation, something going back to the days of ancient Greece. Now, most of the Grecian islands in the Aegean Sea were just that. They were islands. They could only have so much of a population, and so the leaders of those different islands had agreements that every so often they'd have wars. They'd supply the loans for those wars. They'd tax the people for the wars, and they would kill off so many of the people. They'd also they'd own the munitions. At that time it was all spears and breastplates and all this kind of stuff. And nothing much has changed. If we jump forward in time to the 1800s, when Mr. Malthus was the top economist for the British East India Company and the British Crown, really the European Crown, because it's all linked together. He came out with his writings on population. People should read this because he was an economist, and economists factor in future projected populations, debt, how much is owed by nations, how many they'll need to pay off that debt on estimates and all these projections, how many people would be surplus and would eat into that debt. And looking at the poor, who were always a problem for them, they found ways of getting rid of them. And Malthus said that they should put the poor in public housing. Housing, of course, would be poorly built and crammed together and put them in marshy areas where they'd have diseases break out. And he called it actually positive population checks. That's what he called them. Those were the terms he used as a top economist for the British Crown and the East India Company. Everyone in the East India Company was a member of royalty or a cousin of royalty. And even Elihu Yale, that was one of the founding members that founded Yale University, was a cousin as well. So they set up their plans long in advance, even for the Americas, but they needed to bring populations down occasionally when it didn't fit into the economic system. At one time they had to breed up the Americas, and when they first started putting settlers into the Americas, by various means, people don't like to leave their homes. They had to get things going to make folk leave their homes and go and open up this country. At that time, it was not a nice place to just walk in and live. You had to cut down trees, forests, drain swamps, start farming, uproot trees by manpower and horsepower. Hard work. And the death toll was pretty high. Most folk didn't live past 50 in these circumstances. And they had to create ways to get them in, so they created lots and lots of laws, penal laws, and put magistrates out there in England and other countries in Europe, because they're all in the same boat. All these countries are linked together with the same system running them and the same families at the top. And eventually you couldn't walk out the door without breaking a law. And they would then arrest you, go in front of the magistrate, who could convict you right away, and you were off on a ship and off to the Americas. They tried it too. The first slaves in the Americas they brought over were white men, mainly from Britain. And the French were doing it in their colonies too. But that's where you get the red neck from, really red shanks initially, because they wore the breeches down to their knee. And the white men got burned, a lot of sunburn at the back of there, because they're always bending down towards the sun and backs to the sun, and they get burns on their legs. But they didn't last too long. They weren't up to the high heat in the south and so on. And so they brought in, they even tried with American Indians and killed a lot of them. And then they brought in the black slaves. And it's quite the history lesson and the horror lesson, because history is horror, natural fact. Up into the 1800s, kings authorized historians to write their memoirs, basically, to give his story. That's what his story is stories. And they always had wrote glowing reports of the king and how beneficent he was and how loved he was by all the people. And it's all farce, it's all fairy tales. These guys down through the ages were spoiled, psychopathic tyrants who were interrelated with all the other kings and queens across Europe, whom they intermarried freely, and they ruled with an iron fist. And right up into the 1900s, they were having public hangings, even in Britain, with people who tried to start unions up. The last two, I think, were hung at Stirling in Scotland. This for a show to the public, not to do the same thing. That's how hard and vicious these people were at the top. And they also created rebellions. They created rebellions in Scotland primarily, with a handful of clans backing Bonnie Prince Charlie, as they call them, who came over from Italy. He spoke Italian and French. He'd been in exile, and that started off a mini rebellion. And they used that as an excuse to clear the Highlands, the entire Highlands pretty well, of Scotland, and they put them off into primarily the Americas to settle the country. That's how you get to move people. You must get an excuse, you make it happen, and then you follow up. Many of these boats too, every London crook and merchant banker, the merchant bankers owned all the tardy little ships that were letting water in. Many of the families could watch their own relatives sink just off the coast, because dozens of the boats did sink, crowded too. And because they put everything into service to try and get these millions of people outside the country and populate the Americas. Then they tried it with other countries, and also, for a stroke of luck, they had the Irish famine, and then that started off a whole bunch more coming in. Good working class people, pretty sturdy and rugged, and that's what they wanted. That's how you do things from a banker's point of view, from an economist's point of view. You need something done, so you created circumstances to allow yourself to do it. And since you have no opposition, because all the bankers are in cahoots, look at the banking families that run the US and England and France and Germany and all the rest of them. It's the same banking families. And they have their headquarters, at least some of them still do, in the City of London, which is a sovereign state status, just like Rome does, and Washington, D.C. So we're looking at, again, a long-term agenda with an elite group of people who plan to bring us into a global society where they won't need us all. I'll be back with more about it after these messages. Hi, folks. Alan Watt back with Cutting Through the Matrix, which is standing in for John Stadtmiller. And just going through some of the little-known events of the past, something that most folk today have been taught not to even look into. It's not terribly exciting, they think. And what could you learn anyway? Well, you learn an awful lot. You find the big names that were sent into the United States to take over the money system. You take the money system over, you own the country. That's as old as the hills, as they say. And they're still doing it. With the Kuhn-Loeb families and the Warburgs that came out of Germany. The Warburgs were amazing because one brother came out of Germany and he was only in the U.S. about two years and given citizenship before World War I broke out, and he was put in charge at the U.S. Federal Reserve and watched all the loans and all that kind of stuff. And then his brother was put in charge of the bank in Germany, and after the war the two of them met at Versailles and signed a treaty and battled out how much the U.S. citizens and how much the Germans owed, because they owed them all to the same bankers who were also related to these Warburgs. Interesting name too, Warburg. A burg is like a mountain, eh? The mountain of war. And they do love mountains in their names because it's all to do with pyramids and stuff. And history's got a lot to teach you when you really look into it. And how the stock market and why they called it Wall Street, what kind of wailing wall is Wall Street? Why is there a wall in the first place? And why did they put it there? Down through history, the Phoenicians, the ancient Phoenicians, at one time ran the trade routes and all the shipping routes of the ancient world. And the Phoenicians were the Greek term for those who lived in Canaan at the time. And they were merchant bankers in their own right, thousands of years ago. And they even got tin from far away places like Britain and brought back. It was mixed with the copper to make bronze, and all the weaponry at that time was made of bronze. So it was a big killing of even warfare products in those days. And the Phoenicians, when they sent their sailors out, they were all members of a brotherhood, a fraternity, that were sworn never to divulge where they went. And for 500 years, they brought tin from Britain, and no one could find out in the Mediterranean or the Middle East where they got it from. So that's quite the brotherhood of secrecy. And down through the ages, again, they took over many little places that go in and trade, and then they'd introduce silver mainly, at that time silver, eventually gold, get the public to accept it, and they would take it back from them in exchange for goods, and back and forth until they got used to it. And then they would go to the head honcho, the king, and lend him money, and before you knew it, the whole country was in debt. And the king didn't mind, because he could live high in the hog and get all the goodies brought in by the Phoenicians. And that's how this alliance, this symbiosis began with royalty and the traders, who were also merchant bankers. They lent money as well. And eventually, these Phoenicians had coastal towns set up, which were factory towns, and everybody in the factory towns were actually slaves, making all the produce that then took to other countries and conned the next system and took it over. That's how it was done. When they didn't, a country wouldn't comply, they go back to all the countries that had already taken over, tell the old king there that they weren't happy with this one country that was not going to accept their trading goods and was not going to accept their money system, and they'd go to war with that country. And they'd sit back and they'd supply all the armies, of course, too, with all that they needed. and they reap massive profits. Nothing has changed down to the present day. Nothing at all has changed down to the present day. And in fact, if you look at the histories of ITT and General Motors and Ford and General Electric and all these big companies that you think are your institutions, they're really big fronts, all intermerged with the big foundations, which are fronts for the banking system and the fraternities that run the world. These fraternities generally go back all the way to London again, like the Royal Institute for International Affairs and Council on Foreign Relations, same branch in the US, only it's called a different name. Because you're still supposed to think you're an independent nation, you see, only for the taxpayer. And they run the entire world. And during the Cold War, this became more evident when the scientists said this war will be won by those with the best sciences, the most advanced sciences. And it was odd to me to watch every year in newspapers the top scientists in Britain and the US being sent over to Russia to meet the top scientists there. Because if you were truly in a Cold War that was supposed to be very, very real, the taxes were doubling then to pay for it all, and all the nuclear missiles we're never going to use, then why would you let your top scientists meet with the top scientists of Russia when supposedly they're always going through this game of double agent, people getting bought off to the other side? You would not allow that to happen if you thought you had advanced science. You wouldn't let them meet each other. They're the last ones you'd allow to meet each other if the war was going to be won with high technology. But that's what happened, because the Cold War was just a farce to get the people in the Russian side working as fast as they could for peanuts, and to get the US side being taxed all the more to pay for high-tech exploration. That's what it was for. And I'll be back. I think this message is coming up. Yep, I'll be back after these following messages. Hi folks, on Watt, back with Cutting Through the Matrix, standing in for John Stadtmiller, and just going through some of the history of this very, very old world, of the same con game going on over and over and over by the same descendants of the same families who interbreed like no one else does on the planet. They marry their cousins, sometimes in times gone by they've married their sisters to keep it all in the family. And that also keeps the wealth in the family and all the secrets of how it's done in the family. But we have too much information on them today for them to keep it totally quiet. But they do to give us lots of distractions and fantastical things to amaze us, and that seems to be what most folk like rather than the bitter truth. Now we've got Bob from Texas on the line. Are you there, Bob?
Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. This may be a critical phone call. Are you okay with that?
A critical phone call?
Yes.
Does that mean the line is going to go hot or burn?
No, it means that I'm going to make some statements that you may interpret as critical.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, you talk very fast. And that raises a red flag to me, because I think you know, there are many matrices. In fact, there's an infinite number of matrices. And you have obviously thought about things very hard, and you selected out one particular matrix, okay?
Yep.
Now, it's not the matrix that's important of all those infinite number. What's important is the glitch in the matrix, the pieces that don't fit.
Mm-hmm.
You follow?
Just repeat that last part.
It's the pieces that don't fit that contain the information. All of the statements you've made really have no informational value, because you've studied it so long. You've made it fit into just one of the infinite number of possible interpretations.
Which one do you think that you're going to kick it with, then?
Well?
Which one do you think you're going to kick it with?
I didn't hear you.
You're talking about something else going to be the answer. What will it be?
Well, for instance, you were talking about how Wall Street got its name, right?
Yeah.
Well, I looked it up on the internet. You know how Wall Street got its name?
Go ahead.
It said Wall Street, its name is a direct reference to a wall that was erected by the Dutch settlers from the southern tip of Manhattan Island in the 17th century.
Yep.
During this time, a war between the English and Dutch threatened to spill over onto the island colonies. So the Dutch, located at the southernmost part of the island, decided to erect a defensive wall.
Yeah.
So there's another interpretation of where Wall Street came from.
Why is it still called Wall Street?
Well, you know, I have no idea, but...
You know about the wall between church and state?
Well...
You know the wall between royalty and the public? You know the wall between banks and the public as well?
Well, those are all things that you can project onto it, okay? The word wall will allow you to project many different... The word wall will allow you to... the word wall is ambiguous. And it will...
Why are you wasting time about a wall here? What do you want to say?
You're the one who brought up wall, the wall between church and state. I was just responding to your...
No, I asked you what the answer was to it.
What I'm trying to tell you is, I don't believe your answer any more than anyone else's answer.
Good for you. Good for you.
Okay?
Good for you. That's true. You're not going to tell us what it is.
What you need to incorporate is the fact that you could be wrong. And then you may actually, in other words, it's the glitch in the matrix. You don't have any glitches anymore. You made everything fit. And that means whenever you create a picture of something, there's always signal and there's always noise. And if you think hard enough about something, you will make the noise fit into your picture.
Okay, so everything is quite normal then, is it?
Pardon me?
You think everything is quite normal?
No, of course I don't think everything is quite normal, and of course I have my own prejudices. I'm just trying to slow you down a little bit and get you to realize that you're a little too fluent, and that raises, at least to me, a red flag.
Okay, that's nice talking to you. Thanks for calling.
Goodbye.
Bye now. Yeah, I can remember going once to a church and arguing with a Sunday school teacher, and they accused me of having the sin of knowledge, because I could quote the Bible back to them, you see. And this is the sort of thing you get with people who are stuck in limbo, because you can think for yourself and figure things out and have a memory to put things together, because you do remember your histories and major events. Those who can't will tend to attack you just as much because they haven't figured it out, and part of them doesn't want to. They'd rather believe it's just all a supernatural game, and it's not supernatural to that extent. What seems to be supernatural is the way that it's done, but when you think that the high sciences are all involved in this, and you do understand the economics and how they work and how many avenues economics goes into, which is pretty well everything in your life, and everything to do with whole populations, to do with their lives, it starts to make sense then. And slavery is nothing new. And what I do is quote the big boys' books themselves, not the conspiracy books about them or the sci-fi books about them, but the books that the ones down through the centuries have published themselves. And beginning with the show, for instance, I talked about Thomas Malthus. And Malthus wanted to put the poor people in what they call poor houses, where they'd be crammed together, preferably on swampy areas. And it worked to death. I don't think you know that it's the poor houses where they put the poor unfortunates, as they called them, mainly women and their families, where their husbands had died through overwork generally during the industrial era. They put them in these poor houses and they worked them to death. You lived maybe 3 to 6 months maximum in those houses, and they profited from them at the same time because they manufactured things as well. Very much like the prison camps in Germany in World War II. They'd use you to manufacture things before they killed you when you were completely exhausted and worn out. Very, very efficient. And IBM were the guys who did the Cardex system, pre-computer, as it was called, the Cardex system. They gave all the numbers out too. And you find these big companies, as I say, still run the world today, but they're integrated with the secret services, with the banking systems, and with the big institutions. They all work together. If they did not work together, they'd be at war with each other all the time, because they'd all have different ideas of what they wanted to do with the world. These guys work together towards this new world order of theirs and their planned society. Now, Malthus, in his own book, came out with the same methods to eliminate the poor and the excess population that they knew would actually, in 100-odd years' time or so, when they started bringing down the industrial era, they knew they'd have too many of them. And he was talking about that time to come and how they should just kill them off with these positive population checks, like disease and plagues, he called them too. We need plagues and disease and wars for positive checks on population growth. And that's how it really, really works. And nothing's changed, because here's a story which most people will think is coincidence, especially the last caller. He'll think this is coincidence, because they like to believe in coincidence theories. And it's MSNBC News. And this is today's news as well. It says here, now you know that they've been putting the people in trailers that were put out of New Orleans after the hurricane, and they're also putting families into these trailers. FEMA trailers are called. FEMA supplies them. And I'm sure some big high mason has the contract to make them. And they put them in these trailers, and it says, toxic gas pervasive in FEMA units test show. Nearly all trailers, mobile homes exceed long-term formaldehyde standards. And this is by Mike Brunker, MSNBC, the 12th of November. More than 2 years after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita battered the Mississippi Gulf Coast, private tests of FEMA travel trailers and mobile homes provided to storm victims indicate that high levels of formaldehyde gas in the units is much more widespread than the government has acknowledged. The previously undisclosed test results from nearly 600 units reviewed by MSNBC.com found that 95% of the temporary housing units provided by FEMA measured at least twice the CDC's, the Center for Disease Control, because they control diseases, maximum recommended level for long-term exposure to the toxic gas, so it's twice as high. In some extreme cases, the levels were 70 times the long-term standard. 70 times. The tests were conducted by the Sierra Club, well, they're friendly, right? A Galveston, Texas law firm that is involved in federal litigation against the manufacturers of the travel trailers and mobile homes that FEMA distributed. So, and it goes on here to say that the federal government promised to test inhabited trailers and mobile homes, but has not yet followed through. Many of the trailers and mobile homes have been occupied for 2 years, which makes the high formaldehyde levels a scientific mystery. It's a mystery. We can do all this stuff with nanotechnology and analyze it, but you just don't know why this is happening, since these levels typically decline significantly when units are ventilated by residents, and that's not true, because everyone in the building trade knows that this stuff gives off gas for 40 years, especially when the sun hits it. It says, I really can't account for it. It's really surprising, said Mary Devaney, a certified industrial hygienist whose Vancouver, Washington firm has conducted more than 100 of the tests. I really can't account for it. The results for mobile homes are especially puzzling, as the units had been presumed to be safer than travel trailers. Mobile homes, which are mounted on a permanent chassis and contain at least 320 square feet of living space, are intended for long-term occupancy. The level of formaldehyde in building materials used in their manufacture is regulated by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what was it Malthus said? Put you in certain places and so be bad for your health. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has halted distribution of travel trailers described as campers no more than 45 feet in length for temporary housing because of formaldehyde concerns, and said it is working to move all 52,520 households currently residing in travel trailers nationwide into permanent housing. It's also said it will provide temporary housing to anyone who expresses a desire to move out the trailers because of formaldehyde. But the agency continues to provide mobile homes to disaster victims, including 50 sent to people left homeless by last month's wildfires in Southern California, according to FEMA spokeswoman Mary Margaret Walker. The agency also has agreed to donate up to 2,000 unused mobile homes. He's another group that want rid of the Native American tribes. Boy, that makes sense. It's very Malthusian. Senator Tim Johnson announced in June. Walker did not respond to queries about the number of people on the Gulf Coast living in FEMA-provided mobile homes. No, he won't. But it is believed to be substantially lower than those in travel trailers. Believed, again, we're going to scrub that last part. Formaldehyde, a chemical used in a wide variety of products, is considered a human carcinogen or cancer-causing substance by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and a probable human carcinogen by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So these folk are all coming down with all of the symptoms of it, which include bloody noses, respiratory distress like asthma, sinus infections, bronchitis, skin rashes, and burning eyes. And the gas is emitted by composite wood and plywood panels in the FEMA unit. Now, composite wood is just where they get all the waste products from, the chips of wood, and glue them all together with this formaldehyde. The big chemical companies are behind it. And anyone who's used that in the long term or in a factory, which I have done, you end up with all these symptoms: bloody noses, massive bronchitis, and infections, and so on. So they knew exactly what they were doing when they built them, only they made sure that these are up to 70 times higher in formaldehyde than regular ones. And who does it hit? Well, it's not the upper middle class, it's the working class people generally who are moved into these units. And that's how it's done. We're supposed to think it's all just coincidence, even though all these things, all these boards, etc., are tested in every part of the production for quality control or exceeding certain standards, but they're 70% more likely to give higher doses of formaldehyde. It's amazing they got through, isn't it? What a coincidence, with all these regulatory factions standing by watching. And that's how it works. Now we have another caller on the line. Are you there? Hello?
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Yeah, I'd like your opinion about this latest little Cold War going on between Russia and the United States. Do you think it's for real, or is it bogus?
I say it's bogus because, I mean, you understand the history of Russia.
I'd like to ask another question and then hang up. I'm at work and I'm also on a cell phone. I don't want to fry my brain, so you can answer. And the second question is, I had asked you once on Dr. Deagle's show about your opinion of the show Lord of the Rings, which I think is great, and I think you would be Frodo defeating the Eye of Sauron, you know, and you were kind of like saying I didn't get to the point of it. So anyway, your comments about the Lord of the Rings a little deeper than the last time I'd asked you. So I'll hang up and listen to the answer.
Okay. Okay, and but to take the last one first, to do with the Lord of the Rings, so you understand who the author was and where he was based when he wrote that. He lived in the university. He lived his whole life in the university. And he was fanatical on his writings to get the words and the words they would use in this particular language that they used perfect, as though it was a factual language, you see. And he had various high poets, friends, well known and so on, who tried to talk to him often, but he was engrossed in his work. He took this very, very seriously to put out all these novels out. So it was more than just novels, because the ring that binds them all is the ring of its interrelationship or intermarriage in a sense as well. It's the different levels that run the world of royal levels, and then you have economic levels, the banking levels, then you have the literary levels that give you your thoughts and novels and write movies and so on, scores, and then entertainment. All these things are part of the other rings, but it would bind them all in their ignorance. It would bind them all, especially the peasants down below. They'd be bound by this ring, interlocked forever. And I'll be back after the following message with more on this. Matrix. I'll be on later tonight too with another one. And we're talking about Lord of the Rings and how so much work, a lifetime of work, went into the creation of these stories, because it was very important always to tantalize the public with something they enjoy, and they can eat their popcorn and blow their gum and say, "Bye, that was good," and have no idea really of the esoteric hidden beneath it. But of course, within it was a story to do with, including the balance, to do with balance of the world, what they call balancing. And you had the different categories of, in a sense, humanity, all coming down from the fairies at the top, and the perfect ones, all down through the categories, and right down to the ones with the big feet, the hobbits. And that was the peasantry. That's what that also was depicting. So it wasn't really that pleasant. But those, what it was also telling you was that those who become illumined at the end, the last one, they become illumined, can never go back to their own people. They can't go back and fit in. They know too much. They've seen the light, as they say, because they're illumined, and they go off into the ship to the land of the blessed, where all illumined ones go and live forever. And that's been a goal of elites in all ages. That's why the pharaohs entombed their bodies, hoping that somehow they could preserve them forever, maybe one day re-inhabit them or activate them. Didn't work too well because they soaked them in bitumen. In fact, they boiled them in them, and rather destroyed everything. But it shows you that the thought was there. The thought was there, and they did a good job. As far as Russia and the US is concerned, if we go into the Bolshevik Revolution and read who funded the Bolshevik Revolution, and you'll find that the banks of New York and London, the big bankers, as always, funded it into power, and funded it all through until it became the Soviet system. And 200 families moved in at the end of World War I into Russia to rule, and those families still rule today. They still rule Russia today. Very wealthy families. And some of them, like Trotsky, or Bronstein, whose name was from New York, he changed his name. He was from New York, and he became a leader of the revolution over there too. And the Russians thought he was actually Russian, but he wasn't. And those same families still run Russia today. So it's all a cozy group, all talking to the same bankers. And interestingly, in the British papers, when the so-called Berlin Wall came down, another wall came down, then Hadrian's Wall too, by the way, in England, you find that there's a guy called Solomon was his chief banker of the Soviet system. And of course everyone said, well, how can that be, because there's no private investment? That's not true. They allowed private banks to exist as long as they didn't claim to make profit off labor. That's how it was worded. And this guy left the Soviet Union with the wealth of the Soviet Union, that whole era, and went over to see who? His cousin Rothschild in England, and that was in the British newspapers at the time. So it's all a big scam, but what they did accomplish during that Soviet era was to get two sides working fervently towards research and development for all the technologies that we're now seeing come in today, which are going to monitor and control all of us. That was the point of it all. The back after the following messages.
Truth is on talk radio.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Ward, standing in for John Stadtmiller. I'm normally on Cutting Through the Matrix, which I'll be on later tonight. And we're talking about the system in which we live, and how it's so interlocked with planning. The average person who's stuck in La La Land can't really fathom that one. They think we're just evolving day by day in society. The crises just crop up out of nowhere, and the politicians argue about solutions. That's how they see the world. They've swallowed the world as it's been presented to them. So much so they can't see the signs and symptoms of a disease, and that's what we're looking at. It's not hard to find the signs and symptoms of one system that's come down through the ages, ruling over vast amounts of people. And they've even published their international meetings at times to do with the next 100 years or the next 200, or, and like Charles Galton, Darwin, the next million years. That's the title of his book, when he talked about the need to cull off a good part of the ones with the inferior genes that wouldn't be needed anymore in a technological type system. And Charles Galton Darwin, in that same book, The Next Million Years, he said there has always existed slavery. And he says all we're doing is creating a new, more sophisticated form of slavery. Well, you see, it's happened. So much so that the slaves either don't really know they're slaves because they think they're just paying taxes and so on for good causes, or they're quite happy with their enslavement. Lots of people are happy with their enslavement, and that has to be considered too. Those ones who are happy with their enslavement tend to be off into what's called, officially, by the way, the insiders call it this, the ones who run the shows call it this, Art Bell clones. Art Bell clones were put out there for those that want to check out the mystifying and ride the waves into the cosmos, because it's much more fun to look at all the what-ifs and ahs and oohs than look at the hard, bare facts of a rather unpleasant system, which right now is using the manpower, really the boys, of various countries, especially the US and Britain, to do rather diabolical things to people in the Middle East. And I just watched a video recently where you see them acting like troopers do in every era, from the Romans and before and beyond, up to the present. And here they are in all their nice new camo gear, kicking Arabs out of their homes, and I mean kicking, by the way, or pulling by the hair, the children, and throwing them on the ground and screaming them to stay there. And that's what the good little boys of the US are doing right now, and the good little boys of Britain. You talk about racism, it's rampant and it's obvious. And you can only see it on the non-censored news that comes out of the Middle East. The rest of it's all dressed up to be nicey-nicey, because you're supposed to think they're all like John Wayne with morals and who sit and fret about what they have to do. No, they don't. They go in with the boot and the butt of the gun, and they're not hesitant to use it. That's the reality as they go around terrorizing. And of course, they don't really care why they're doing it. They know that Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. That came out at the inquiry. Mr. Bush said it himself when he admitted to the world, I never said that Hussein had anything to do with 9/11. I just think he was a bad man. The world's better off without him. Well, that's quite a comment for the guy who's supposed to be the president of a country, the biggest country, most wealthiest country, to say. That's what tyrants say. You get rid of somebody because you didn't like him. I'll be back after these messages. Hi, folks. Alan Watt back, standing in for John Stadtmiller. Trying to cut through the big matrix out here, because it's big, it's interwoven, it's what we call reality, and it's all pretty well controlled. And we have Bona from California on the line. Are you there? Hello?
Thank you. I wanted to... Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. I happen to know the original reason for the name Wall Street with the original capital of New York, which was Kingston, New York.
Yeah, Kingston.
Before Kingston was burned, that was the New York, that was the capital of New York, the state.
Yes.
But my point is that the Dutch colonized Kingston, New York. It was called Wildwoods at that time, in 1650 approximately,
yep.
At which time different people came, including Jews and other people from various religions. Mm-hmm. The Jews, according to their custom, set up a wall for their animal sacrifices, and according to Jewish custom, business has always been conducted at the same time that the animals are sacrificed. So that was actually the beginning of the stock market.
Yeah.
And then after Kingston was burned out by...
And that's why they call it the stock market.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that!
Yeah, that's why they use animal terms for stock market.
Fabulous!
Yeah, you have a bear market and you have a bull market.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for letting me add that tidbit, and for you adding my knowledge. That is so interesting.
Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting, that's how the United Nations was donated to their land by Rockefeller, and that was the largest kosher slaughterhouse in New York as well.
Well, oh really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, you sure know a lot about my subject, so I better just go back to listening to you.
Well, thanks for calling in.
And I want to thank you very much.
Thank you for calling.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Now, there's Darren from Rhode Island. Are you there?
Hello, Alan.
Hello.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about, you've discussed about the plan to use Britain as the world's police force, then the United States, and then you've talked about planning to put into place China as the world's police force. Now, is there a timeline for that, or could you elaborate on that?
Well, I know that Arnold Toynbee, who taught at Oxford University, he took over from his father, also by the same name, Arnold Toynbee, professor. And he spoke on behalf of the internationalists. He led internationalist rallies, in fact, and talked with an exoteric tongue and an esoteric tongue in the same speeches. But he did talk about, in his own books, he wrote, I think, a 12 or 13 compendium of history, and he also was a member of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and he went to all their meetings. Now, he talked about the role of Britain had been to take over and create an empire, because there have always been empires where the wealthy move out, move in, leave the money, or take the money from the ones they leave behind, and they collapse, and then they move into the new house, so to speak, and make it prosper, because all their shipping will then come in there. But he talked about how Britain had led that field for centuries, and how in the beginning of the 1900s, after World War I, or during World War I, they realized they'd have to pass the torch on to the United States to take over and lead this. And from there you can go from Professor Carroll Quigley, who talks about the Anglo-American establishment, and how the same families who are related, who go back to the Opium Wars, they made millions of Opium Wars, they've always been involved with drugs and bringing down countries through all kinds of means and taking over the wealth of those countries. He goes on further to explain it, but getting back to Toynbee, Toynbee talked about how the U.S., this is from one of the meetings at the Royal Institute for International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations, and he said that the U.S. would lead the field. This is after World War II, and towards the end, he says, or towards the end, before the millennium was out, they'd falter, they'd have a setback, because industry would start moving out. Then, he said, they would rally again and maybe have a couple more victories. Now, we had Vietnam, and it sort of fell backwards. And then you had little ones after that. He said, then eventually it will fall again after the main one, which will appear to be winning. And then China was would be set by that time and into the next millennium to take over as a policeman of the world. Yeah.
So basically, in the 21st century, sometime China will take over as the economic and military superpower.
That's right. That's right, and we're pretty well there. The U.S. has one last job to do, and that's to standardize the complete Middle East under the same system. In fact, I read from a reporter, it was in a newspaper, he was one of the advisors around the president, and he blurted out something. He says, well, there's always been an empire, he says, and this is the empire of the new American century. That's the group this crowd all belong to. And they said, we shall give you your thoughts, and you'll believe them, and we'll give you different versions of the thoughts, then you'll believe them too. He says, you'll believe whatever we tell you to believe. That's how arrogant they are. But yeah, China is the main manufacturer now, and in their own economic laws, those who do the production are the ones who always end up with the strongest country. That's what made America prosperous, was all industry. And China's taken over. We're now a service economy back here, and service economies, according again to the same economists that amalgamated Europe, can only paddle the water for so long before you go under, because you don't produce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you can't pay the tax money. The tax base will be in China.
Yeah, that's largely what the United States has become, a service sector economy.
Yes.
It really it'll come down to fulfilling the U.S. in respect to the United States, finishing off the job in the Middle East and keep us, them, so to speak, keeping us going until that job is finished. But then once that's done, they'll just basically pull the plug, pull out, and establish China as the new superpower.
Yeah, Jacques Attali, who was the advisor to various French presidents and who was one of the spear leaders who drew up the European Union, he wrote a book called Millennium, Winners and Losers in the Coming New World Order, published about 1990 or 91. Before he left, I went to one of the head departments of the United Nations. So get a hold of that book, and in it he said, the next boat people will be those leaving the Americas, mainly the U.S., looking for work abroad because there'll be none at home, because all the infrastructure has been pulled out of home. And that's happened. You see, all the factories are now in China, and that was done deliberately. And as you're finishing off the Middle East, they're already devaluating your dollar because you have to merge with Canada by 2010. That was all agreed with the free trade negotiations before the NAFTA negotiations. And now they're signing it every year, and they have 3 more to do to 2010. You'll see Hoover's in next year, and the Prime Ministers of Canada and Mexico signing the next agreement. These are all further integrations. We're interlocked now, and they admit on the news in Canada that your security agencies, your CIA, FBI, are totally integrated with those of Canada. They're also merging the tax base, by the way. I don't know if you know about that. They're merging the tax base and all import duties together into the same system. In fact, certain high bureaucrats in Ottawa in Canada can now, in certain departments, can look for equivalent jobs stateside. They can ask for a transfer to the ones in Washington, D.C., and vice versa. We are integrated already.
Yes, that's certainly true. So they discuss how Americans will be fleeing the United States into other countries such as China?
Wherever they can get in.
Wherever they can get a job? Or...
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's very interesting. All right, thanks a lot, Alan.
Thanks for calling. And there's Rick in Nevada. Are you there, Rick?
Thanks for having me, Alan.
How are you?
Good, are you?
I'm surviving here.
Good. I have 3 or 4 points I'd like to make quickly and then get your feedback on them, if I may.
Okay.
First off, it's a very recent development, and that is the rapid disappearance of the machine tool industry in the United States, which represents not only part of the means of production, but the means of self-defense for a country.
Yes. Yeah.
Also, the United Nations has been outfitted with ammunition which will penetrate the armor of local police forces in the United States.
Yes.
This is a cause for concern. And my third and fourth points are the Sunni Arab Muslim group, which recently sided with the United States military against Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
I have to admit that I find this a cause for concern, because this may give people the false belief that this is, after all, a just war, when it is, in fact, an unjust war and a genocide.
It is a genocide. I've got so much footage come in of people blown up and shot down, and children and women and the U.S. troops. I mean, kicking these people like you wouldn't believe.
I don't doubt it.
It's disgusting. Yeah.
Quickly, I'd like to state also that the impending nuclear attack or war against Iran, we need to oppose this at all costs.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. I'll be back after the following messages. Hi, folks. Alan Watt back, filling for John Stadtmiller and cutting through this jolly old matrix of ours. I shouldn't say ours because we didn't design it. In fact, we've just noticed it, at least most of us have. And it's all around us. And to finish off from the last caller, the Guardian Unlimited on 10th of November put up an article about Abu Abed, the U.S.'s new ally against Al-Qaeda. It goes down to mention this particular character. It says he's got the manners of a mafia don. because he's a warlord. He was formerly an insurgent, supposedly, for Al-Qaeda. And it says here, Abu Abed, a member of the insurgent Islamic Army. Insurgent means people who are coming into the country to fight. Has recently, the Vietnamese were called insurgents too, by the way, has recently become the commander of the US-sponsored Ameria Knights. It was a knight thing again, a brotherhood, you see, a fraternity. He's one of the new breed of Sunni warlords who are being paid by the US to fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Americans call their new allies concerned citizens. They're concerned citizens, these mafia dons. That's what they are, but the US has no qualms at hiring, mass murderers, basically. They've done it before. In fact, as I say, in New York, according to some books out there, Wall Street, The Rise of Hitler by Professor Anthony Sutton, tells you that New York had no problem backing him too. Married at Ford and all the big boys, including some of the Bushes, they were put up for trading with the enemy all through World War II. Nothing's new with these pirates, and they hire crooks all over the planet to do their dirty work. So there's nothing really new in that. Now we have Rusty from Alabama. Are you there?
Yes.
Hello.
Alan.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I have 3 questions. I'm really curious. You have such a huge wealth of knowledge. I'm curious about your education, how you accumulated this knowledge.
Yep.
Your belief system to combat it, and behind how to combat it, I guess your strategy. Because you speak and it's you seem kind of ambiguous to me. I can't find any real strategies or goals on how we should move forward.
Yes.
So I'd just like to hear your response to that.
Well, the strategies really are non-compliance. Non-compliance. You see, everything that's run in this system, even in ancient times, had to do with training a population that everything they were taught was true.
Right.
And that this hierarchy had the right to rule over them and use them for workers, even before they used taxes. Taxes came later. They used the people for workers, like slaves, and they actually taught them this was normal. This was a normal way of life. In India, they taught people that it was your karma. That's why you were a slave, and they taught you to believe that. And so you never thought about becoming something higher. You were taught it was impossible to. You had bad karma, and so you accepted your lot in life. And that's how they all rationalized it with each other and their tremendous, awful poverty. And Egypt did the same thing, and it goes on today. However, for the last few hundred years, since at least the advent of the term democracy, which was a front for the system, as the politicians are, they're front groups, the same aristocracy and elite still run the world today.
Are there any examples, though, in history that you can think of where a culture effectively combated this system? Because it's so linear, the way you explain history, it's almost like it's an unbroken chain of oppression.
Yeah, down through the ages, there's been people, the Spartans tried to keep their own monetary system, and the Trapezi, the moneylenders, we call them, came in, and they already had wars all over that area as it took country after country down, bribed off the local priests and had them working on the public's minds. But the Spartans stood them off for a long time, an awful long time, in fact. And they continued to use iron, an easily obtainable form of currency. They used iron to the bitter end, rather than accept the gold and silver that came in by these looters and these characters who had access to all the gold and silver mines.
I guess it's timely because Alex Jones's film Endgame's coming out, and it's at this point in history where I believe that it's for the whole shoot match. We've got to have some way of finally once and for all.
Yeah. Well, what it is that even the ones we can see who are fronts, we got to start demanding to know all about them, whatever association they have been or are, or have given their allegiance to. Even if they claim that they've come out of the Council on Foreign Relations to run for politics, that's what they say, that's what they tell you. That doesn't happen. They're always meeting with the same peer groups. And you already know what high global associations they already belong to. You've got to find out who's funding them. That's very important, very telling. and their lives have got to be an open book for the first time, and we got to stop complying with everything they do so blindly and like cringing cowards, and that there are many passive ways to do it, because all down through the ages they need your compliance to make their system work and happen.
So do you believe, another person I listen to is Mr. Bill Deagle, and one of his philosophies is that we're passing through a nexus where it's the end of their reign, and that there is a new system coming, and that we're just sensing the first birth pains of what's happening, and the fact that we are waking up in such huge numbers.
We're waking up, and again, I want to caution people, not scare them, but don't forget that they plan in centuries ahead, like big corporations do. Big corporations plan the next 100 years of investments, even. And that's how they plan the future. They also look out to see what the counter-reactions to their agenda will be at every point.
So how do we snap out? That's my question.
We snap out and stop following blindly the leaders they present to us, and start becoming humane again to each other. I'll be back after the following messages. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, standing in for John Stadtmiller. I'll be on Cutting Through the Matrix after 1 hour has passed, in which I hope to warm my dinner and eat it and do all the things I have to do for tonight, including get the wood in. It's rather wet wood because it's raining like crazy out here and has been for days. We're all shrinking, and I think it's really a plot to make us all small so we can fit in matchboxes, and that'll solve all their problems with eating up the world's resources, won't it? But getting back to what I was saying, this system is all pervasive. It's been given to us as our reality. And it's a hard thing for people to break through, that most of those things they've come to love, and even when words will prompt you like Pavlov's dogs to cry, to do with your country, national anthems, all those kind of things, use Pavlovian techniques and responses, using tribalism, which is instinctive with us all, and the responses we give them. Using a sign over the heart, which was all the way back to the Egyptians, as in my books. People should buy them and read them. I show you these statues with the same hand over the heart stuff done by the nobility of Egypt. And we got to realize that they need us. They need us always, every step of the way, to comply with them. And that's why in wartime, the first casualty of war is the truth. It's the first thing that goes out the window. Because wars are planned. They don't happen spontaneously. They're always planned. And you find even with the School of the Americas, that's based at Fort Bragg, they now changed the name to a much more fuzzy, nice-sounding name. Some of the School of the World or something, since the world is a target, where they train people to go all over the planet as terrorists working for the government and start wars. We've got to stop supporting all of this so quietly and calmly and live in fear all the time. When your own government makes you afraid, you know something stinks to high heaven, something is rotten somewhere, and you better go by your instincts. You got to start talking about it rather than all keep quiet and change the topics onto nice fuzzy things or what's on television or the latest sports results. You got to go back into it and talk to people about things that they have to talk about because it involves everyone here. This is not a nice agenda. It's a global agenda. The U.S. has pretty well financed it through the taxpayers' money. They've kept the United Nations afloat, that other big front for the big corporations, this world system. And the corporations are all in bed with the big foundations and the media, and with all the old establishment, the establishment of the established families that go down through the ages, holding on to the wealth, always getting more, always profiting, and always keeping it in the families. It's been like that for thousands of years. And it's got to stop. And they hope to use high technology. All the stuff that we paid for during the Cold War was to track, trace us, and monitor us. And I've read lots about that from their own sources. And we've got to stop this before it gets any further. It's gone too far already. In fact, someone has to eventually, in the new system, come in and throw all those laws out the window, because we have the right to privacy. People had wars in the past because there was no privacy when we lived in the feudal system, but now we're going into the new type of corporate feudalism, as Carol Quigley called it, where the CEOs will run the world, the big pirates. Then we're going back into the same feudal system where there's no privacy. We're all owned. And we can't have that, can we? Now, get on that topic there, here's an Intel official saying in the U.S., goodbye to privacy. This was called November 11th, 11:39 on My Way. And it says here by Pamela Hess, Washington, top intelligence official says it's time that people in the United States change their definition of privacy. Remember, Bush changed your definition of freedom. He called it the new freedom. You better look into that, because that really was an official statement there, a legal statement. It's been changed. So now you have to change your definition of privacy. It's time you all changed it according to this particular official. Privacy no longer can mean anonymity, says Donald Kerr, the principal deputy director of national intelligence. Instead, it should mean that government and businesses properly safeguard people's private communications and financial information. Kerr's comments come as Congress is taking a second look at the Foreign Surveillance Intelligence Act. Lawmakers hastily changed the 1978 law last summer to allow the government to eavesdrop inside the United States without court permission, so long as one end of the conversation was reasonably believed to be located outside the U.S. That means, I guess, outside Washington, D.C. The original law required a court order for any surveillance conducted on U.S. soil to protect Americans' privacy. The White House argued that the law was obstructing intelligence gathering, which is snooping. The most contentious issue in the new legislation is whether to shield telecommunications companies from civil lawsuits for allegedly giving the government access to people's private emails and phone calls without a court order from 2001 to 2007. Some lawmakers, including members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, appear reluctant to grant immunity. Suits might be the only way to determine how far the government has burrowed into people's privacy without court permission. The committee is expected to decide this week whether its version of the bill will protect telecommunications companies. The central witness in a California lawsuit against AT&T, that keeps coming up, AT&T, says the government is vacuuming up billions of emails and phone calls as they pass through an AT&T switching station in San Francisco. Mark Klein, a retired AT&T technician, helped connect a device in 2003 that he says diverted and copied onto a government supercomputer every call, email, and internet site access on AT&T lines. So there you go. That's your privacy for you. It's gone down the tube, or really down the telephone line. And it was designed that way because the beautiful New World Order is a world I read last week on my own show. I talked about the fact that every citizen will be surveyed completely. And I read from the guys who actually made the statements. Look into my sites and you'll find them all. I use the real data. I don't go into outer space to get it. I don't look for walking reptilians or crocodiles that have evolved. I just tell you what the big boys themselves put out for you to follow, and we should take some notice of what they actually say. So now they're going after your privacy. Actually, they're giving themselves reasons to do it. They've been doing it for donkey's years before 9/11. They just want to make it all nice and legal. And in ancient times, you used to get decrees by kings and queens, royal decrees. That was a law. You just said something and it was a law. And then you had papal bulls for centuries when the Catholic Church ruled, and you had papal bulls. That was the law. And then, of course, we had legislation and bills, and then they called it the legal system. And it's the same old thing. It's what they say is law is law. And if you lived in a little place in New York in the 20s, if the mafia came into your store and said, you'll do this, this, and this, well, that was him giving you the law. That's what law is. It's an order with the threat of the use of force to be followed by force if you don't comply. That's what law is, in fact. And the whole judiciary system came out of the old French system, the feudal system, where the knights contended on the battlefield. That's why they call it a court. It's a court of law, because they had the contest on a court in front of the king and queen. And the peasantry, you see, could not defend themselves. You couldn't get up on a horse and charge somebody across there because you were of lesser birth. So you needed a champion. Today they call them lawyers and tell you to keep your mouth shut in court because you're a peasant, you see. And use a lot of terminology you don't understand. And all it is a battle between different terminology and which one knows the most. And that's how they decide their battles. the accused generally has nothing to do with it. He's on the sidelines as these two go through their routines with each other to show how witty they are. That's what law is. It's a scam. And I think Devil's Advocate's a great movie, actually. And Pacino played the part very, very well, showing you what the devil was, in a sense. And he says a statement in there from the biggest law office in New York. He says, you know how we're taking over the world, he says, by laws. Every year we churn out thousands more from universities. We're creating armies of lawyers, and that's what they've done. There's no one employs more lawyers than governments, right down to your local governments. And it's all to do with the wording. In the beginning was the Word, and God spoke it into existence. So the reality is spoken into existence with language, you see, and we comply. Because we're taught to believe one version of the Word. We don't get the higher versions of the Word. You have to think about them, and you can figure them out quite easily. But that's what it really means. In the beginning was the Word. You speak the Word into existence. You must speak it. And proclamations is how they used to call it. They proclaimed, gave proclamations out, and you all obeyed. And that was law. And I think Mao Zedong said law came from the barrel of a gun. That was his form of law. The mafia would agree with that too, and so did the big boys, because if you don't pay your property taxes or whatever else they're after, they come in with their heavies. They give them different titles, but they're still heavies, and they will beat you up or kill you. And that's what big gangs do. They employ the lesser henchmen down below to do their jobs. And even in the mafia, they had lieutenants and captains and all the rest of it, and we have the same thing happening here. You're taught to perceive extortion in a different way by all the propaganda that's been put into you. I think the best author on the law or legal system who went to work at the United Nations and the best sociologist in the world was Jacques Ellul. That's E-L-L-U-L. Read his books. He points it out as it actually is. He said all the movies you've watched, all the detective series on television, hospital dramas and so on, and courtroom dramas are all propaganda to elevate those systems in your mind into a supernatural, almost superhuman system. So you kowtow down to it, you believe in it, you worship it, you feel inferior, and you leave it all up to them, because these are institutions which are going to run your lives in the very near future. You see the laws coming out now from the medical side of things, but all the inoculations they want us to give you, that's imperative for them, because down through the ages, these bankers also, and they still do, own the big pharmaceutical agencies. The same bankers that lend to countries are the same guys who own the big pharmaceutical agencies. And in ancient Egypt, the big merchants as well had the same scam. They ran the gold, the silver into the country. They brought the merchandising in and sold it, but they also ran the drug industry, even in those days. And they've even done autopsies on old mummies and found opium and heroin, of all things, heroin and coke. Now, coke comes from Latin America, from the coca tree. That tells you they'd already been across the world in those days. And that was a film put out, a documentary from France. They did a modern autopsy on some of the old mummies they found, the pharaohs in Egypt, and found pure cocaine in it, in the stomachs, which were kept in canopy jars, canopic jars. And it's a pure substance. It doesn't deteriorate over time, so it was easily identified. So it's quite amazing to see the same system going down through the ages. And they run the legal system on the outside world for the people to believe in, and they run the underworld as well, as above, so below, as they say. So they run, when they can't do it legally, it would tick off the public or worry them. They simply get the underworld to do the dirty work for them. But one way or another, they always get what they want. And if you look into the histories of the Rothschilds, for instance, their name was Bayer. They still own one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and so did the other big ones too, own Sandoz and other companies, the big boys that make the drugs. But they also run the other side of the drug industry, because those big boys financed the wars. They financed Britain and the US and the opium wars against China, and that's how they brought China down. They brought in all bales of opium from India and Afghanistan, because that was the opium triangle, as it was called at the time, the Crescent. And they brought it in ships and dumped it into China to addict as many people as possible, to bring down the will of the Chinese not to not to resist them and bring the culture in. They wanted to get in and loot the country. And for a while, they did get a hold on eastern China. They had divisions on the seaports, split up between the French, the Americans, the British, and so on, until the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers kicked them out. So, but they never gave up, of course, never gave up. So the better way to do it was to eventually pay off the guys, give them a system called communism. They all thought they were going to have their own everything, put in your own men at the top, and then you industrialize them down the road, and they become the top communist capitalists of the world. Quite an amazing system, isn't it? Because officially China is still called communist, although they're running the biggest capitalist system of industry we've ever seen. And we're supposed to believe all this is quite natural, but the same bankers made China, the same official establishment, old families, made China what they are today. And they own China, they own the top officials there too. It's all done through brotherhoods and associations and fraternities, by the way, right down to the lower officials. So nothing has changed in the system. If you behave well and you work towards the great work, as they call it, they give you knighthoods. And it's quite amazing that after the 1800s, when the second constitution was created in the U.S., that they agreed not to give official titles to any American politicians or citizens. Well, look how many have been made sir in the last 20, 30 years. I think Kissinger and different ones have all gone over there and been knighted by the Queen. And no one talks about the fact that they were not supposed to be so, because they now work for the Queen, who still, under their own titles, run and own a good part of the world. They own the countries. The Commonwealth countries are not democracies as you think they are, because every official in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries swears allegiance only to the Crown, to the Queen, and all her descendants to come, not to the country they're serving. That's how real it still is. So democracy was a sham to begin with. But it was a good sham because they found from the 1700s that people would eventually rebel every 5 or 6 years. And so what you do is you get an election every 4 or 5 years, and they vote the last bunch of corrupt guys out and get the new bunch of corrupt guys in. That's how democracy works. It stalls rebellion. It's a placebo to the public, and the elite can go on their merry way with their plans, which is a global society, and they publish much about the global system they wanted to bring in. The United Nations, again, that beautiful straw dog there, that goes under the beneficent sham of helping, and actually is the biggest war hog on the planet. I tell the Rwandans how much they helped them as they denied all the stuff sent in by General Romeo Dallaire when they sent in all the reports about impending catastrophe, and the UN kept telling them to keep quiet and just sit there, etc. And then the slaughter started and continued unabated, and it broke that man pretty well broke him. Living through that, he could not figure out, and still hasn't, by the way, the UN didn't done that deliberately, because they don't want what they call useless eaters. Now, we're back after the following messages. Hi folks, Alan Watt back, standing in for John Stadtmiller. Listen later on, I'll be on again after 1 hour on Cutting Through the Matrix, where I go into a lot of these problems we face. And yes, not all hopeless, because people are really, there's a lot more people waking up at different levels to be sure, but when people start to be aware, even through intuition, if nothing else, if they haven't been affected yet financially or whatever, intuition is starting to wake up and scream that something is very, very wrong, and they're starting to talk. We should never, ever be afraid to talk. We must talk. It's a survival mechanism to communicate to other people what's happening, and eventually you'll find those who will listen, and those are the ones who are important. That's how movements start, because these people at the top must be exposed now. Their plan is published. They want to vastly reduce the population. They want to use science to re-engineer humanity, enhance them, as they call, better slaves. And we have to stop this, because this is affecting all of us, and we have the right to stop it. We have the right to decide which way society shall go. And we've got to do it now. don't be cowed into submission and quietness, because they'll come round to you regardless. It's going to affect you regardless. So try and keep your head down. It's going to be no use in this one. And for those who want to go into the spiritual side of things, well, what is spirit? It's the activating force that's in you, the life they called it. Those who had no spirit, they called the dead. You let the dead bury their dead in all ages. That was the esoteric meaning, all down through the ages. Those who were trying to walk, those who were crippled but trying to walk, meant those who were waking up and trying to walk in the footsteps of those who knew. That's what it always meant. You give the information to those ones, they don't know all the facts, give them the facts, and they will become active. They'll walk very quickly. And those that don't want to see, they're the blind. You have a hard time making the blind see. They don't want to see, that's a choice. But you can also get through to some of them eventually with persistence. And that's how things are done, because it's our lives are at stake. It's the children that are coming up. Their lives are at stake, and those who are yet to be born as normal human beings and not these modified types of beautiful new slaves for the elite's utopia. That's what we're facing, and that's what we're fighting for. And there's many passive ways to do it, and we have the rights to do it as well. And we've got to start by demanding to know everything in every association, that these characters, right to your school board, right up the whole way up the ladder to the top, what associations they already belong to, and go into their family histories, because that'll tell you more than what they'll ever admit to. And leopards don't change their spots unless they're genetically modified. And so you'll find the dirt there. The dirt is always there. We're run by a system of gangsters, very well-educated gangsters that front for them on television as spokesmen and so on, but gangsters nonetheless. And we've got to get rid of this system. It will either kill us all off, or eventually we've got to change it one way or another, but we have no option. And we owe it to those who've gone before and didn't know, and who suffered and went through war after war as well. And we owe it to all those who are yet unborn, who will come up into a different kind of world, this brave new world of Huxley. It's a nightmare for ordinary people, where you're drugged and altered and all the rest of it your whole life long. We can't allow that to happen, and that's the system they want to bring in. For those that want my stuff, see what I've got for sale, look into Cutting Through the Matrix. Of deceit, because the entire system and entire reality that has been put into us, it didn't happen by accident. We don't just roll down through the centuries stumbling along with politicians sorting out problems here and there on a daily basis. Far, far from it. The politicians are really the fronts for very powerful families, and always were. And that's what democracy is, in fact. And in the US too, even though it had a form of democracy within the republic, which meant it had sort of bars around it so that they couldn't knock those bars down and extend their powers, well, that went down long ago. And they have extended their powers. I think it was President Wilson who first used the term openly about America being a democratic nation. The same man who fronted for other people, very powerful people behind him, and which he admitted to in his own writings eventually, who gave the League of Nations the start, the embryo of a new world order, a world system, a standardized system which had been the dream of the elite for a long, long time. I'm pretty certain for probably thousands of years. And they saw it coming into view, and the best way to get it going was to get world wars going and getting everyone involved in these world wars. Therefore, they spent about 100 years creating alliances, building up to the wars, and then getting the wars started. It wasn't too difficult, because young men, who are pretty stupid, by the way, young men tend to be rather stupid. They run on hormones, and the tribal system is still strong within them, and they want to belong. They want to belong to the biggest gang that has some kind of authority over others, and that is approved by the government. And young men having no power in their own daily lives, because most of them come from the working class or unemployed, that's generally how it is throughout the ages, they join the military. I'm not talking about drafting people in from all occupations. These guys join the military, so really they're mercenaries, and they get off on the national emblems that every country's been given with their flags and their various medals and all this kind of stuff. And they're taught to go out and kill. It's interesting to watch the Queen of England, for instance, go through her inauguration many, many years ago, sitting on the raised dais, which is just a pyramid, step pyramid, holding the scepter and a little part that looks like a little crook, like the pharaoh did in ancient times. You'll see the same thing chiseled out in the stelas in Egypt. So ceremonies that were carried out thousands of years ago, right down to the ermine round the neck, the ermine, the black and white dots that Nimrod wore, are still worn today, and no one tells us why. Very interesting. But our world has been run by small groups, a small group really of people, down through the ages that moved around, even in ancient times. And we tend to forget that Egypt itself dominated the ancient world for almost 5,000 years. That's a long time. A long 5,000 years. And they used to create cities for bureaucrats to deal with all their State Department, you might call it, or Foreign Affairs Department in the Commonwealth countries, to deal with all the incoming and outgoing mail. And they found some of these cities and dug up tablets with all the data that modern bureaucracies deal with. And it's mainly to do with population, how many people are there, how many pay taxes, and all the buying and selling taxes as well costed into it all. It was a huge business thousands of years ago, and nothing much has changed. Nothing much has changed except that after moving down through the centuries and pulling their money out of one empire as they create the next, and flattening the one behind it, they're up to the global system now. The world, you see, is the little scepter she holds in her hand. And I'll be back after the following messages with more on this topic. Hi, folks. I'm Alan Watt, standing in for John Stadtmiller from Cutting Through the Matrix. The Matrix, the world around you as you have been taught to perceive it, and all that makes it tick, and how it interacts together. And it truly is one huge web. I was when Mr. Malthus was the top economist for the British East India Company and the British Crown, really the European Crown, because it's all linked together. He came out with his writings on population. People should read this because he was an economist, and economists factor in future projected populations, debt, how much is owed by nations, how many they'll need to pay off that debt on estimates and all these projections, how many people would be surplus and would eat into that debt. And looking at the poor, who were always a problem for them, they found ways of getting rid of them. And Malthus said that they should put the poor in public housing. Housing, of course, would be poorly built and crammed together and put them in marshy areas where they'd have diseases break out. And he called it actually positive population checks. That's what he called them. Those were the terms he used as a top economist for the British Crown and the East India Company. Everyone in the East India Company was a member of royalty or a cousin of royalty. And even Elihu Yale, that was one of the founding members that founded Yale University, was a cousin as well. So they set up their plans long in advance, even for the Americas, but they needed to bring populations down occasionally when it didn't fit into the economic system. At one time they had to breed up the Americas, and when they first started putting settlers into the Americas by various means, people don't like to leave their homes. They had to get things going to make folk leave their homes and go and open up this country. That time was not a nice place to just walk in and live. You had to cut down trees, forests, drain swamps, start farming, uproot trees by manpower and horsepower. Hard work. And the death toll was pretty high. Most folk didn't live past 50 in these circumstances. And they had to create ways to get them in so they couldn't plunder, and feel very proud of it, although the people back home generally get the real story 50 years after the war, and had nothing to do with what you were told at the time. Everything you were told is always propaganda, because, as Karl Marx said, all wars are economic in nature, and sure enough, the big pirates at the top plunder every country they go into. That was how they lived down through the centuries. And some of these pirate families are allowed a certain amount of chess moves within this board game of theirs, this board game which it's a bunch of rules that apply to them only. That's what knighthood is all about. Knights were sworn, they took allegiance to serve a master at any cost and obey any order they were given. And so the modern knights that came up through the pirate era, the skull and bones, going from the Knights Templars right upwards, and that was a symbol, by the way, of Knights Templars flag. When they went to sea, it was a skull and bones. They became the pirates, and they looted a good part of the planet. So they were allowed to have competition between powerful families, even though these big families were often related, in fact. And they push each other out the way sometimes, and take over other countries, but they always spare their cousins. And that's what kings and queens were about down through the ages. They had ongoing wars which are tremendously profitable, and it also serves the purpose of depopulation, something going back to the days of ancient Greece. Now, most of the Grecian islands in the Aegean Sea were just that. They were islands. They could only have so much of a population. And so the leaders of those different islands had agreements that every so often they'd have wars. They'd supply the loans for those wars. They'd tax the people for the wars, and they would kill off so many of the people. They'd also they'd own the munitions. At that time it was all spears and breastplates and all this kind of stuff. And nothing much has changed. If we jump forward in time to the 1800s. Hi folks, this is Alan Watt, filling in for John Stadtmiller. And you'll excuse me standing in. I won't stand for the full 2 hours, I'll sit as well. But I got a call about an hour ago asking me to come in. Those who have heard me before hear me on Cutting Through the Matrix, where I go into the histories of this poor old planet of ours that really doesn't belong to us and probably never did, unless you get there before the advent of wealth and money. And this is November the 12th, 2007. Those who can still speak the tongues of Europe, and those who are listening from Europe, look into Alan Watt Sentient Sentinel, and you can get transcripts downloaded for free with the different languages of Europe. And I have to thank all the staff that helped me out in all this. There's a lot of people involved. Although I could do with a few more of myself here. Maybe that's what the Superman had the right idea. He could duplicate himself and have all these robots doing all his work for him. Kind of like the Federal Reserve. I often wonder if they're all just clones. But that's the world we live in. It's an ongoing show where reality has been propagated to the public, instilled in our minds, helped by our parents who didn't know any better either, and way down the line for thousands of years, because the world is run by select few. A select few families, really, that interbreed like crazy, and have held the incredible wealth. In fact, they decided what wealth was a long, long time ago. And it's very interesting that all of their symbols go back to Egypt. And all of those same symbols are all around us in company logos today, especially the big boys, the ones who own all the banks. And I'm certain they've also been behind the creation of all the major religions. They certainly have dominated them and run them right up to the present. And they're the elite of all religious groups. They're the top of all religious groups. And the big mystery is, who are these people?